Hello and welcome to Art Block, the show where we talk about art and how it's made. Today on the chopping block is the topic of copying versus referencing. To be honest, there's a lot more to this topic than meets the eye. When you break it down, I generally tend to think of this topic as a few smaller discussions rather than one big one. So without further ado, let's get into it. Unfortunately, art theft is a lot more common than you think. With the vast power that comes with using the internet, art can be stolen quite easily, especially if the artist doesn't take proper precautions to protect their work. Art theft is essentially when someone posts and/or uses another artist's work without their permission. This can range anywhere from using another artist's work as a profile picture to outright selling the artist's work. It's unfortunate that artists who put a lot of hard work into their art end up getting their stuff stolen, and it's unfortunately a lot more common with artists who make a living and/or have really good artwork. And it doesn't have to be individual people either. I've seen companies take my old work and sell it on stuff like t-shirts without my permission. I need to really quickly point out that uploading someone else's work without their permission is in fact stealing, and you can get into quite a bit of legal trouble if you're not careful. I've covered the topic more in depth in my art theft video. The link is in the card for those who haven't seen it or need a refresher. And just a word to art commissioners as well. If you decide you want to upload your artist's work to your page, please be sure that you have their explicit permission to upload their work. I know it might seem like you're doing them a big favor, but unless you have their permission and properly credit them in the description, then it's almost as bad as stealing, even though you've paid money for it. And I'll be honest, if you're commissioning an artist for something like a book cover, they have to be aware that you're going to upload their stuff to your page. But please just be sure to double check before you do anything that might cause you a bit of trouble. I should also point out that if you're wary of someone being an art thief, you can also run a reverse image check to see where else the image is uploaded. Basically, the way you can do this is if you go to your Google search engine and do a search by image. It'll bring up all the other results of where the image is coming from. Obviously, this won't work every time, but it's a pretty good idea to do, especially if you're considering commissioning said artist. While tracing isn't quite as bad as theft by comparison, it is still something I would not recommend doing if you want to improve as an artist. Now really quickly, I want to give a shout out to my friend Elicity, who was very kind to allow me to use his art as an example for this video. Go check him out if you haven't already. He really deserves a lot more watchers than he currently has. So as an example of what tracing someone's work looks like, here's his original piece. Now here's the traced version. The trick for telling when someone's artwork is traced is when you overlap the two and they literally look like they came from the same place. I'll admit when you're in the very early stages of art, it's difficult to learn how to draw things yourself, but that's where the benefit of practice comes in. It doesn't always have to be the entire body either. I've seen people take pictures of hands or difficult areas and drew over the model. Guys, even models need to make money. Their image is their intellectual property. My recommendation is when you're in the earliest stages of drawing, you should try and draw it on your own the best you can, and even if you can't seem to get it right, then just take a break and come back to it in a little bit. A lot of early stage artists tend to spend a lot of time on one piece, and when they can't get it right, they'll often either give up or find someone else's work to trace because it's easier. I do have to give a very big warning though. If you are in the stage where you are required to trace in order to get a good product, don't take commissions or requests. I know it's tempting to earn money, but even my earliest works were drawn by hand. This unfortunately starts to dive into scammer territory, which if you're not careful can get you into some serious trouble. So while tracing isn't exactly art theft, it is pretty close because you are taking someone else's work and using it for your personal benefit. This is a bit of a tricky one. For those not in the know, remixing is when you use free resources such as a base in order to make something of your own. Admittedly, this is a bit of a gray area since the original creator obviously made the resource for use by the public, though for profit is a bit of a different story. Depending on how much you're remixing the original work, you may not want to take commissions if you can't work without the original. In cases like a base where the modifications you're making are usually just hair and clothes, then you should be sure not to only credit the artist, but you don't want to take money for what others have made. In instances where you're remixing something like, say, a stock image in order to make the picture work and you manage to get a fair way off from the original in terms of the look, then you may be in the clear. However, be sure of your sources and don't use anything that is clearly made by another artist for your own gain. The amount that you remix a picture or resource is really dependent on the situation. There are instances where using the original piece in its entirety is acceptable and there are cases of fair use. However, that's another rabbit hole on its own. Personally, if I'm going to recommend anything, I wouldn't take any commissions that involve you remixing an illustration, a base, or professional photography that isn't a stock image. You can learn from them, but I don't recommend using them for paid work, especially when paid work is supposed to be 100% yours. Copying is kind of similar to tracing, though it does involve you using your own art skills to make your art. Copying can also be considered as drawing from life or heavy referencing, but just hear me out here. While copying isn't exactly as easy to do as tracing, it still isn't a great way to develop your skills as an artist because you're only learning how to draw specific poses rather than learning to draw completely by hand. I would encourage anyone who isn't quite at the stage of drawing freehand to try something that is called drawing from life. Now, technically, drawing from life is a skill you need to learn when it comes to being an artist, but when it comes to learning your drawing techniques, replicating what you see is actually highly recommended when it comes to drawing anatomy and understanding lighting. It's also a good opportunity to try out new mediums and techniques if you're fresh out of the gates. Unfortunately, this is where the line is a bit fuzzy because a lot of newer artists will unintentionally copy just a little too much and end up getting flack for it. I'd recommend if you end up copying someone's art unintentionally and someone points it out to contact the original artist and see what they want you to do about it. Hopefully they'll be pretty reasonable about it, and if they politely ask for you to take it down, then I would follow through on that request. Just for an example, I drew up a quick rough on my character with a similar pose to the drawing you guys saw earlier. The pose is different, but it is a little too spookily similar not to raise some suspicion. If you're worried that you might have gotten a little too close to the original piece, just use the same litmus test for tracing. Lastly, we have referencing and inspiration. This is the absolute best way to go about things because your art is yours and yours alone. And just to clarify on the whole referencing versus copying thing, while copying is doing something almost note for note, a drawing that uses references is drawn completely on your own and simply uses stuff like photos to help you with stuff that might be difficult, such as hands. I know it seems confusing, but just imagine that you have a hand and instead of drawing exactly how it is in the picture, you use it to study the bone structure of said hand and how the pose works. Referencing, especially off of photographs, is a really good way for you to learn how to draw and gives you the opportunity to try some new things with your art. Inspiration is a really great way to create stuff you're really excited about making that is somewhat based off of something you've seen by someone else, and then making something that is entirely on your own. For example, I tend to get really inspired when I see something that either has a style that I find appealing, or something completely bizarre that just gets those creative juices flowing. A major differentiator between all of these different options is how someone executes on the finished product. Even if you're working with a similar concept or similar execution, as long as you're making all of your own work from scratch or giving proper credit, then you should be okay. So what are your thoughts on copying versus referencing? Drop them in the comments below. If you liked what you saw and you want to see more, make sure to subscribe and share this video around. Also be sure to follow me on Twitter and DeviantArt where I post art and other funny stuff, and if you're interested in helping behind the scenes, I have a Patreon where you can pledge money and get special perks. That's all for today, I'm Spirit, and I'll see you next time.